He was 12 years old. He couldn't vote, drive, or buy a lottery ticket. But Florida decided he was old enough to be charged as an adult for murder. His name is Cristian Fernandez, and in 2011, he became the youngest person in modern United States history to face first-degree murder charges in adult court. The victim was his 2-year-old half-brother, David. This is a story about a crime that shocked a nation, but it's also about something deeper. It's about what happens when a child raised in violence becomes violent himself. And it forces us to ask an impossible question: who was really on trial? This is Accused, where we don't just tell you what happened. We ask why the system let it happen. On March 14, 2011, in Jacksonville, Florida, emergency responders rushed to an apartment after receiving a 911 call. A 2-year-old boy named David Galarraga was unconscious. His mother, Bianela Susana, told paramedics that David had fallen and hit his head in the bathroom. The little boy was rushed to the hospital, but he never woke up. 2 days later, on March 16th, David died from his injuries. At first, doctors thought it might have been a tragic accident. Toddlers fall all the time. But when medical examiners performed an autopsy, they found something concerning. David hadn't just suffered one injury. He had a skull fracture and severe brain swelling. The medical examiner also found evidence of older injuries. This wasn't an accident. This was a pattern of harm. And it had been going on for a while. The police investigation turned to the people living in that apartment. David's mother, Bianela, lived there with her boyfriend and several children, including 12-year-old Cristian Fernandez. Cristian was Bianela's oldest son and David's half-brother. During questioning, Cristian admitted to police that he had pushed David. He said the toddler wouldn't stop crying, and he got frustrated. According to the police report, Cristian pushed David, causing the little boy's head to hit a bookshelf. Cristian told investigators he was scared and didn't know what to do, so he didn't tell anyone right away. But there was another troubling detail. Bianela Susana, David's mother, allegedly waited several hours before calling 911 after finding David unconscious. Prosecutors would later argue that this delay may have cost David his life. She was charged with aggravated manslaughter of a child for failing to get him medical help in time. For Cristian, the consequences were far more severe. On July 1, 2011, State Attorney Angela Corey made a decision that would ignite a national firestorm. She charged 12-year-old Cristian Fernandez as an adult with first-degree murder. If convicted, Cristian faced life in prison without the possibility of parole. He became the youngest person in modern American history to be charged as an adult for murder. The decision was controversial from the start. Angela Corey defended her choice by saying that the crime was serious and that Cristian understood right from wrong. She pointed to his statements to police and argued that he showed a lack of remorse. The prosecution's position was clear. Age doesn't excuse violence, and justice for David required holding Cristian fully accountable. Corey had a reputation for being tough on crime. She had been elected state attorney for Florida's 4th Judicial Circuit in 2008, running on a platform that promised to crack down on violent offenders. Her decision to charge Cristian as an adult fit that pattern, but it also put her at the center of a national debate about juvenile justice. In Florida, prosecutors have what's called direct file authority. This means they can decide, without a judge's approval, to charge certain juveniles as adults. Florida is one of only 15 states that give prosecutors this much power. In most other states, a judge has to hold a hearing and decide whether a child should be tried as an adult. But in Florida, that decision belongs entirely to the prosecutor. Critics have long argued that this system is unfair because it removes important protections for children and allows bias to influence who gets charged as an adult and who doesn't. The charges against Cristian included first-degree murder and 2 counts of aggravated child abuse. The aggravated child abuse charges related not only to David's death, but also to evidence that David had been harmed over time. Prosecutors built a case that painted Cristian as dangerous and violent, someone who had hurt his little brother repeatedly and ultimately caused his death. But to understand how a 12-year-old could be accused of murder, you have to understand the life Cristian Fernandez lived before that terrible day in March. And if you're already hooked, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is about to reveal layers you won't believe. On Accused, we go all the way down. Cristian Fernandez was born into a cycle of harm. His mother, Bianela Susana, was just 14 years old when she gave birth to him. She was a child herself, barely old enough to understand what it meant to be a parent. Cristian's father was not involved in his life. From the very beginning, Cristian's childhood was defined by instability. Poverty and chaos. When Cristian was just 2 years old, his mother's boyfriend at the time was convicted of harming him severely. The boyfriend was later sent to prison for his actions against the toddler. Bianella was also a victim in that relationship. She had been living with a man who was dangerous, and both she and her son suffered as a result. After that boyfriend was arrested and sent to prison, Bianella continued to struggle. She moved frequently, often staying with relatives or friends, sometimes living in unstable and unsafe environments. The cycle continued. Cristian grew up moving from place to place, living in homes filled with domestic conflict and neglect. He witnessed his mother being mistreated by different partners over the years. He saw fights, heard screaming, and lived in constant fear. For a young child, this kind of environment doesn't just cause emotional pain. It literally changes the way the brain develops. Children who grow up in homes with chronic instability have higher levels of stress hormones in their bodies, which can damage the parts of the brain responsible for learning, memory, and emotional control. By the time Cristian was 8 years old, he experienced further harm from an older cousin. He never received therapy or counseling to help him process the trauma. At age 9, Cristian attempted to take his own life. He survived, but the incident was a clear cry for help. And still, no one truly intervened in a meaningful way. Florida's Department of Children and Families, known as DCF, had been involved with Cristian's family multiple times over the years. There were reports of neglect, reports of unsafe living conditions, and reports of concerning situations. But despite these red flags, Cristian remained in his mother's care. The system that was supposed to protect him failed over and over again. According to court records, DCF had opened investigations into Bianella's home at least 3 times before David's death. Each time, caseworkers noted concerns, but the cases were eventually closed without significant intervention. This is not uncommon. Child Protective Services agencies across the country are overwhelmed, underfunded, and dealing with enormous caseloads. Workers are often forced to make difficult decisions about which cases are urgent enough to remove a child from their home. In Cristian's case, those decisions left him in danger. Teachers at his schools noticed behavioral problems. Cristian struggled academically and socially. He was described as a child who had trouble controlling his emotions and who seemed angry and withdrawn. School records show that he had frequent outbursts, got into conflicts with other students, and had difficulty focusing in class. These are classic signs of trauma in children. But instead of consistent mental health support, Cristian moved between schools and homes. He was placed in foster care briefly, but those placements didn't last. He always ended up back with his mother. One of the most heartbreaking details about Cristian's childhood is how many people saw that something was wrong but couldn't or didn't do enough to help. Teachers saw it. Doctors saw it. Social workers saw it. But the supports that Cristian needed, things like long-term therapy, stable housing, and a safe adult who could advocate for him, never materialized. He fell through every crack in the system. By 2011, Cristian was living with Bianella, her boyfriend, and several younger half-siblings, including 2-year-old David. Cristian had experienced more trauma in his 12 years than many adults experience in a lifetime. He had been harmed, neglected, and had witnessed domestic conflict. He had attempted to end his own life, and he had never received proper treatment for any of it. Psychologists who later evaluated Cristian diagnosed him with post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. He also showed signs of reactive attachment disorder, a condition that develops in children who don't form healthy emotional bonds with caregivers due to severe neglect. His brain had been shaped by trauma. Studies show that children who experience chronic instability and harm have measurable changes in their brain development, particularly in areas that control impulse, emotion, and decision-making. One psychologist who evaluated Cristian described him as a boy who had learned that the world was a dangerous place where adults could not be trusted. He had never experienced the kind of consistent, loving care that helps children develop empathy and emotional regulation. Instead, he had learned to survive. And sometimes survival in an unstable home means developing unhealthy coping mechanisms. This doesn't excuse what happened to David. A 2-year-old child is gone, and that is a tragedy that can never be undone. But it does raise a question that made this case so controversial. Can you hold a child fully responsible when every adult in his life failed to protect him or teach him how to manage his own pain? The case went to court, and the public was divided. On one side were people who believed that Cristian deserved to be punished harshly. They argued that he caused the death of a defenseless toddler and that the justice system had to send a message that such acts would not be tolerated, regardless of age. Some pointed to the fact that Cristian allegedly didn't immediately seek help for David after the incident, which they saw as evidence of understanding what happened. They said that a 12-year-old knows that hurting a baby is wrong, and that Cristian should face serious consequences. On the other side were child advocates, psychologists, and criminal justice reform activists who argued that charging a 12-year-old as an adult was ineffective and ignored what we know about child development. They pointed to research showing that children's brains are not fully developed, especially the prefrontal cortex, which controls judgment, impulse control, and understanding consequences. A 12-year-old simply does not think like an adult. The human brain continues developing until around age 25, and the last parts to mature are the ones that help us make good decisions and control our impulses. This is why teenagers and young adults are more likely to take risks, act impulsively, and fail to think through the consequences of their actions. It's not a character flaw. It's biology. Advocates also highlighted Cristian's history of trauma, arguing that he was a victim long before he became a perpetrator. They said that punishing Cristian as an adult ignored everything we know about child development and trauma. Instead of helping him heal, it would only cause more harm. National organizations, including the Children's Campaign and the Campaign for Youth Justice, called for Cristian to be tried in juvenile court, where the focus would be on rehabilitation rather than punishment. The case drew national media attention. News outlets ran stories, and Cristian's case became the face of a larger debate about how America treats its most troubled children. Petitions circulated online demanding that the charges be reduced. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse. The pressure was intense. Some advocates argued that the media coverage itself was harmful, turning a traumatized child into a spectacle and making it even harder for him to get a fair outcome. Cristian's defense team fought hard. His lawyers argued that trying him as an adult violated his constitutional rights and ignored decades of research on child development and trauma. They presented evidence of his history, his attempt on his own life, and his mental health diagnoses. They brought in experts who testified that Cristian's ability to understand the consequences of his actions was severely impaired by his trauma. One psychologist testified that Cristian had the emotional development of a much younger child because of the neglect he had suffered. Another expert explained that children who experience trauma often have what's called a dysregulated stress response. This means their bodies and brains are constantly in a state of high alert, as if they're always preparing for danger. This makes it very difficult for them to calm down, think clearly, or respond appropriately to stress. The defense also pointed out that Florida's juvenile justice system was designed for exactly this kind of situation. Juvenile facilities offered education, therapy, and rehabilitation programs that could help Cristian heal and hopefully prevent him from harming anyone else. Sending him to adult prison, they argued, would only make things worse. Studies show that children held in adult jails and prisons are 5 times more likely to be harmed by other inmates than children in juvenile facilities. They are also twice as likely to be mistreated by staff and 8 times more likely to attempt self-harm. The environment in adult prisons is not designed for children. It is designed to punish and contain, not to help or heal. Meanwhile, the prosecution continued to argue that Cristian was dangerous and that the severity of the crime justified adult charges. They pointed to statements Cristian made to police and argued that he understood what he had done. They also highlighted the evidence of prior incidents, suggesting that Cristian had harmed David before and would likely harm others in the future if not held accountable. The SCO legal battle over whether Cristian would be tried as an adult or transferred to juvenile court dragged on for months. His defense team filed motions arguing that Florida's direct file law was unconstitutional and that the prosecutor had not exercised appropriate discretion by charging such a young child as an adult. The judge in the case had to weigh difficult questions. Was Cristian capable of standing trial? Did he understand the charges against him? Could he assist in his own defense? And most importantly, was there any chance he could be rehabilitated? During this time, Cristian remained in custody, held in a juvenile detention center while the legal battle played out. Experts who evaluated him during this period noted that he was small for his age, quiet, and seemed deeply affected by everything that had happened. He struggled to talk about his feelings and often seemed confused or scared. One report described him as a child who had been failed by every system that should have protected him. And then, in 2013, a deal was reached. Cristian Fernandez agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for the prosecution dropping the first-degree murder charge. As part of the plea agreement, Cristian was sentenced to 8 years in a juvenile detention facility, followed by probation until he turned 19. It was a compromise. Cristian would serve time, but he would not spend the rest of his life in prison. The plea deal also meant that he would be held in a juvenile facility, where he would have access to education and mental health services, rather than being sent to an adult prison. For many people, the plea deal felt like the best possible outcome in an impossible situation. It acknowledged that Cristian had done something terrible, but it also recognized that he was a child who had been shaped by trauma and deserved a chance to change. For others, especially those who felt that justice for David required a harsher punishment, the plea deal was a disappointment. In January 2018, Cristian was released from custody. He was 19 years old. Because of privacy laws protecting juveniles, very little is known about his life after release. His attorneys and advocates have said that he was working to rebuild his life and that he wanted privacy to move forward. Whether Cristian has been able to overcome the trauma of his childhood and his time in the justice system, we don't know. He was released under strict probation conditions, which meant he had to follow certain rules and check in regularly with a probation officer. As of now, there have been no public reports of him reoffending or violating his probation. As for his mother, Bianela Susana was convicted of aggravated manslaughter in David's death. She was sentenced to prison and was released in 2017 after serving her time. Her case raised its own uncomfortable questions. Bianela was herself a victim. She became a mother at 14 and repeated the cycle that had defined her own childhood. Does that make her less responsible for failing to protect David? Or does it just show how deeply broken the system is? Some people have argued that Bianela should have faced harsher charges because she was the adult and the parent, and it was her job to keep her children safe. Others have pointed out that Bianela was barely more than a child herself when Cristian was born, and that she never received the support or resources she needed to break the cycle. The truth is that both Bianela and Cristian were victims of a system that failed them long before David was born. Bianela grew up in poverty and instability. She became a teenage mother with no support, no education, and no resources. She was trapped in a cycle of harmful relationships and had no idea how to protect herself, let alone her children. The system that should have helped her become a stable, capable parent didn't do its job. And the cycle continued, generation after generation. Cristian Fernandez's case matters because it exposes something troubling about the way we treat children in America. Every year, thousands of children are charged as adults in the United States. According to the Campaign for Youth Justice, approximately 250,000 youth are tried, sentenced, or incarcerated as adults every year in the United States. Many of them, like Cristian, come from backgrounds of severe instability and poverty. Studies show that children charged as adults are more likely to be Black or Latino, and more likely to come from low-income families. The system is not equal and it is not fair. The idea of charging children as adults became popular in the 1990s, during a time when politicians and prosecutors were fearful of a wave of so-called super predators. This was a theory, now completely discredited, that claimed a generation of violent young criminals was coming who had no conscience and no hope of rehabilitation. The term was popularized by political scientist John DiIulio, who warned that a wave of violent juvenile crime was about to sweep the nation. In response, states across the country passed laws making it easier to try children in adult court. These laws were often called tough on crime measures, and they were politically popular at the time. But the super predator theory was wrong. The predicted wave of violent youth crime never happened. In fact, juvenile crime rates have been falling for decades. And research has shown that these tough-on-crime laws don't make communities safer. In fact, children who are sent to adult prisons are more likely to reoffend when they get out than children who go through the juvenile system. A study by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found that youth transferred to adult court had higher rates of reoffending than youth who remained in the juvenile system. They are also at much higher risk of being harmed while incarcerated. Despite this evidence, many of these laws are still on the books. Florida continues to give prosecutors the power to directly file charges against juveniles in adult court. And every year, children as young as 10 or 11 are charged as adults in states across the country. Cristian's case brought national attention to this issue, but it didn't lead to widespread reform. Advocates continue to push for changes to the law, arguing that children should always be tried in juvenile court, where the focus is on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Christian's case also forces us to think about what justice really means. For David's family, justice might have meant seeing Cristian held accountable for a long time. They lost a 2-year-old boy who never got the chance to grow up, and their grief is unimaginable. For child advocates, justice meant giving Cristian a chance to heal and change. They saw a boy who had been failed by every adult in his life and who deserved an opportunity to become something other than the sum of his trauma. There is no easy answer. A 2-year-old boy is gone. A 12-year-old boy was raised in terrible circumstances, and a system that could have stopped any of this did nothing until it was too late. The question that haunts this case is not just what happened in that apartment in Jacksonville in March 2011. The question is how we got there. How did a 12-year-old boy end up in a situation where he was capable of causing the death of his toddler brother? How did the adults who were supposed to protect both of them fail so completely? And how does our justice system decide when a child is responsible for their actions and when they are simply the product of the environment we created for them? Cristian's story is not unique. Across the country, there are thousands of children growing up in homes where instability, neglect, and harm are the norm. Many of them will never hurt anyone. They will survive their childhoods and go on to build better lives. But some of them, like Cristian, will repeat the cycle. They will become harmful themselves, either because they were never taught another way, or because their brains were so damaged by trauma that they can't control their impulses. And when that happens, we have to decide as a society how we respond. Do we see them as victims who need help, or do we see them as offenders who need to be punished? The science is clear. Children are different from adults. Their brains are still developing, and they are far more capable of change than adults are. The Supreme Court has recognized this in a series of decisions over the past 2 decades. In 2005, the court ruled that it is unconstitutional to execute someone for a crime they committed when they were under 18. In 2010, the court ruled that sentencing a juvenile to life without parole for a non-homicide offense is unconstitutional. And in 2012, the court ruled that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles, even in homicide cases, are unconstitutional. The court's reasoning in all of these cases was the same. Children are different, and they deserve to be treated differently. But despite these rulings, thousands of children are still being charged and sentenced as adults every year. The laws have not caught up with the science or with our evolving understanding of childhood and trauma. Cristian Fernandez's case is a reminder of what happens when we treat children like adults. We take away their chance to change, and we ensure that the cycle continues. It's also worth considering what happened to the other children in that home. Cristian had several younger half-siblings who were living in the apartment when David passed away. What happened to them? Were they placed in safer homes? Did they get therapy to help them process the trauma of losing their brother and seeing their older brother arrested? The public records don't tell us much about what happened to those children, but their story is part of this tragedy too. They grew up in the same environment that shaped Cristian. They witnessed the same instability, and they will carry the weight of what happened for the rest of their lives. This case also raises questions about how we as a society think about punishment and accountability. We want to believe that people who do terrible things should be punished, and that punishment will somehow make things right. But what does punishment accomplish when the person being punished is a child who was harmed and neglected their entire life? Does it bring David back? Does it make Cristian less dangerous? Does it prevent other children from growing up in unstable homes? The answer to all of those questions is no. Punishment, especially harsh punishment like life in prison, doesn't solve the underlying problems that led to this tragedy. What might have made a difference is intervention much earlier. If Cristian had been removed from his mother's home when he was 2 and placed in a safe, stable foster home with parents who could help him heal from the harm he had already suffered. If he had received therapy and support after being harmed at age 8. If someone had taken his attempt on his own life seriously and gotten him the mental health care he desperately needed. If teachers and social workers and doctors had been given the resources and the authority to truly protect him. Any one of those interventions might have changed the course of his life. And David might still be alive. But those interventions didn't happen. And so we end up with a case like this, where a 12-year-old boy is charged with murder and a 2-year-old boy is gone. and everyone is left asking how it came to this. Cristian Fernandez is a name that should haunt us, not just because of what he did, but because of what was done to him first. This isn't about excusing harm. It's about understanding how we create it. David Galarraga deserved a life. Cristian Fernandez deserved a childhood. They both deserved better than the system that failed them. And until we address the root causes of instability and neglect, we will keep seeing cases like this. We will keep seeing children who are victims becoming perpetrators. And we will keep asking ourselves how this could have happened, even though the answer is right in front of us. The system failed Cristian Fernandez. It failed David Galarraga. It failed Bianella Susana. And it fails thousands of children every single day. The question is, what are we going to do about it? So what do you think? Was charging Cristian as an adult justice, or was it something else entirely? Do you think the system could have prevented this tragedy? And what responsibility do we, as a society, have to protect children before they become either victims or perpetrators? Drop a comment and let's talk about it. And if you want more stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about crime and punishment, subscribe to Accused.